So we're live again and coming to you. I'm from Xinjiang in northwest China in a small hotel room. Sorry about the lighting. It's the best I can do. And Cameron Leckie, former major in the Australian Army, is coming to us from his home in Queensland, Brisbane, right, Cameron?
That's correct. Thanks, Jerry.
Yeah. And how's your PhD studying going?
Yeah, I haven't been writing as much as I have in the last couple of years, and that's largely because I have a PhD to finish. So I'm coming to the pointy end, and hopefully by either the end of this year or early next year, I'll have it submitted. So fingers crossed.
Good luck with all of that.
Yeah.
And you were in China a little while ago. We'll come to that at the end of the discussion, because today we're talking about the military. And particularly the military parade to start with, and then the proposed or supposed military threats from China. So let's get straight into it. There are massive changes, interesting things going on in Ukraine and Washington, but I'd like to just focus on China. I know that you've got a big military interest in what's going on in Europe, but for today, let's just keep it on China and come back to the Ukraine conflict at a later time.
Sure.
Beijing's preparing for a military parade. That appears to be the biggest in history. It's actually their 19th military parade since the CPC was formed, since the People's Republic was formed in 1949. And it's the second one to celebrate what they call V-Day or Victory Day. Some people in Australia are saying this is a bit of a threat to Australian interests. What do you say about that?
Well, there are some people in Australia that say whatever China does is a threat to Australia because that serves their purpose, which is obviously to perpetuate the China as threat narrative, which justifies, policy, expenditure, etc. by the government. But I think if you break it down, like every country has a military, they have parades of at different times, different sorts. When I was a cadet, like a couple of times a year, there'd be 1,000 cadets or close enough to it out on parade, and we'd all be marching back and forward and saluting and yes sirring and no sirring. Normally, have a relatively big audience, and that it's just what countries do. They do it for several reasons. Part of it's sending a message, like it's a presentation of strength. The U.S. Army had their 250th anniversary earlier in the year, and on President Trump's birthday, they had their little parade, 6,000 odd soldiers. 150 odd vehicles, I think, and over 50 helicopters. So, they did the parade thing as well. And it's also for the members of the military, like there's not too many soldiers who particularly like drill, but there is something about when you're in part of something bigger than yourself, a big parade, everything goes well, you're all marching in step, dressed up in your dress uniform, and that is, a bit of pride and esprit de corps that comes out of that. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why countries do parades, and I guess for China coming up, it's marking a milestone, so it makes perfect sense to when you have a major milestone, you have a big parade to support it. So to call it a threat to Australia is sort of, I think, a fairly long bow to pull, Jerry.
True enough. Have you paid any attention to China's military parades in the past?
No, not really. Just in passing, like no more than what you really see on the news, so to speak. Right. Because it always makes good footage when they're doing their China coverage to have long ranks of armored vehicles and soldiers marching and aircraft, and normally finishes off some missiles being fired from ships or something like that. So it's all good footage. But every country, as I said, every country does parades, and for multiple purposes. And if they want to, if the Chinese want to commemorate a big event, I think they've earned the right to do so.
Yeah, I wrote an article about this a while ago and actually made a video. Are you aware how many people were killed in the anti-Japanese war, the war against Japan?
Yeah. It's I always wanted to join the army, like from as long as I remember. So even as a kid, a teenager, I read a lot about military history. Obviously, officer training. I studied history when I was at the Australian Defence Force Academy, and one of the subjects we studied was World War II. After I graduated, I kept reading military history, so I read a probably broader range of topics now, but certainly from a teenage years through to young adult, I read a huge amount about World War II. I think I can remember 2 books which had some mention of China's involvement in World War II. One of them was a memoir from a Chindit. Are you familiar with the Chindits?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the British or Allied forces who flew into Burma during the Second
Burma,
World War.
right. Yeah, and they used to
Um,
do hops across the mountains into China.
That's right. Yes, that's right. And the other one was Field Marshal Sim's book "Defeat into Victory," which is about the 14th Army, and that too, is based around Burma, and that's probably one of my favourite military history books, to be honest. And how much out of all that reading do you think I learned about Chinese involvement in World War II?
Yeah, that's the point I was trying to make there, why I asked that question, because it seems to have been kind of written out by Hollywood. Hollywood say America won this war. Had it not been for those nasty Japs bombing Pearl Harbor, then Americans wouldn't have come in and nothing would have happened. But in fact, from 1931 to 1945, Chinese military were fighting the Japanese military. From 1937 in earnest, but from 1931 to 1937, there were skirmishes going on and minor battles. But from 1937, it started in earnest as what became the Second World War, the war of aggression, a war against the aggression of the Japanese. So more than 20 million civilians, believed to be about 24 million, but some people say 30 million, but more than 20 million civilians died. And about 4 million Chinese military died during this period of time.
And that's and that's the sort of point I was trying to make, Jerry, is that it's just totally, and I consider myself above average in my knowledge of military history.
I would say so.
But, it had, until the last couple of years, so that figure I now know, but until the last, probably since I left the military, to be honest, that I actually sort of came to realize just how many people killed in China. And it's sort of interesting too, like the two countries that suffered the most in World War II are Russia and China, who combined lost, somewhere in over 50 million people. But we downplay the role of these two countries in winning World War II, and I think it's warped our perception of current events as well. And I think also, Australia lost a significant amount of soldiers in World War II for the size of our population. I think it's about 40,000. So that's a lot of people, but it pales into comparison compared to 30 million. And also, most of the fighting that Australia was involved in was far away from our shores. So yes, we had Darwin bombed. My grandfather was actually in Darwin when it was bombed. He was in the Air Force in World War II. We had, I think, the submarine fired a couple of torpedoes and did some relatively minor damage in Sydney Harbour. But there's a few other bombing raids. But other than that, we pretty well got off unscathed. When you think the scale of the destruction and the death that's occurred in both Russia and in China, well, that I would suggest leaves a much greater. I mean, it leaves World War II and our military history in Australia has a great impact on our culture and our history. But you compare that to if that had happened on our soil and at a much greater scale, I think it leaves a much deeper mark. The psyche of a country, and I guess that's being illustrated by the parade to commemorate the end of the war that's coming up.
Yeah, I think the idea, and the idea that I concluded within the article that I wrote, basically said this is the People's Liberation Army promising Chinese people that they won't allow this to happen again, and that's the main thing, because the Second World War actually ended 100 years of basically Chinese subjugation, because they were actually raided. And I don't know if many people know this, but were you aware that the Australian Army were fighting in the Boxer Rebellion here?
Yes. Yeah.
I don't think many people would know that.
No, I imagine that's. I mean, I haven't read for quite a while, but yeah, we sent a contingent over, and there's the imagery of the Chinese have been captured with the boxings around their necks, the timber sort of frames or something to hold the prisoners or whatever in place. So yeah, so like so much of Australia's history, anytime there's been a colonial military adventure, we seem to jump on board as the outpost of the British Empire.
You had a good discussion with Alex Bristow based on this. It seems to me that history is being rewritten. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so he wrote an article. So I guess we should probably mention who Alex Bristow is. So he works for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, one of your and my favourite organisations, Jerry.
Favourite.
Yes, and he's formerly, before working for ASPI, was a UK citizen. I'm not sure if he still is, but he now he works for ASPI. But he worked for the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office and also the Cabinet Office, which is this information is available on the ASPI website. So I guess to start off with, that might give you a bit of a inkling as to what his take on the world is, and some of the language that he's used in his article. So as soon as people start using terms such as authoritarians versus democracy, which is some of the phrases that he uses, you know that this is not, they're arguing for an ideology. They're not actually providing a real argument or analysis of what's occurring in the world. And he's basically arguing that the Russians and the Chinese are rewriting the history of World War II and, to sort of suit their authoritarian regimes. And I thought it was quite, most people you think you talk to, you read or whatever, you think, they're genuine, they're doing it for the right reasons. But I think there's also people who are either true believers in a certain worldview, an ideologue, or they know what they're doing and are writing, knowingly writing in a way that trying to influence people, even though they know it's what they're writing is not really a reflection of reality. And I think that's what that piece was. It's, if anyone was using, the end of World War II to weaponize it, I think Mr. Bristow could be accused of that, as opposed to the Russians and Chinese. Every country, we have our own mythology. Like Australia, we have the Anzac mythology. That's what countries do after wars, because we have to try and make sense of, all the slaughter and all the carnage. Each, they are myths, so they may have some relationship to reality, but they aren't reality per se. So yes, we could argue that the Chinese are using it for their own advantage, to propel or suggest a narrative which may vary from the truth or what actually happened somewhat. But then every country in the world does that. So when you start trying to use that as an argument to say that the authoritarians are trying to undermine the liberal rules-based order, etc., I think that it's Mr. Bristow who's doing the weaponizing of history.
Why do you think? Because I often ask people this question: are you misinformed or are you part of the misinformation? Because if you're misinformed, here's some information. Let's have a discussion about it. I'm quite happy and open-minded about this, and I can discuss this with some people. But when they appear to be part of the misinformation, I'm not going to bother trying to put them right, because I know that they just don't care what's right, because they only want to purport this. Why do you think people do that? Like Bristow, ASPI are obviously paid to do this by weapons manufacturers. That surely can't be the only reason. Why do they do this?
I'm not sure if you come across Will Shriver on Twitter or X. He's an American. He's a pretty sharp commentator, and he calls these people empire evangelists. And I think a lot of the people who push these messages, that's how I would describe them. They're true believers in the imperial cause, which is really United States-led hegemony supported by the collective West. That's what they're arguing for, and they will go to extreme lengths to further that cause. And we can just see, when we're talking extreme lengths, we can see what's happening in Ukraine. Whole countries being destroyed to further that objective. So they're ruthless. So truth, they'll use truth when it's in their or parts of the truth when it helps further their argument, and then they'll warp or omit, or they know what they're doing largely. I think some people actually fully believe it, as in they believe we're actually doing the right thing, but I think a lot of them actually know that they're telling porcupines and they're using it for a purpose. And I guess in Australia, I'd suggest that probably the lead in this field is actually Mike Pizzullo. Have you come across him before?
Yeah. Yeah.
So he's the former Secretary of Home Affairs, who was sacked for serial breaches of the Public Service Code of Conduct, and he's been resurrected by ASPI, and I think the Liberal National Party in Australia is also supportive of him. I think if Peter Dutton had to become our Prime Minister, he'd be back in a position of power. But when I read his writing, it sends a chill down my spine. And I think he's someone who knows exactly what's happening in the world. But rather than saying, all right, the world's changed, how do we adapt to it? He's trying to send a mess. He's trying to manipulate people so that we basically militarise the entire Australian economy to support, the maintenance I think the United States has lost hegemony, but to try and regain US hegemony, with Australia being a key supporter of that.
Trevor's made a good comment here. We have to thank the Chinese people for the risks that they took, including saving the lives of many Americans who were on an aborted mission that landed in China, saving the lives of them. But there's a movie just come out very, very recently about the rescue by Chinese fishermen of 384 British soldiers who were prisoners of war on caught up on a sinking ship. Now, I don't know who torpedoed that ship, but it was a Japanese ship, and it was torpedoed, and the Japanese were machine gunning the prisoners in the water rather than let them escape to safety. And so the Chinese fishermen, with no protection whatsoever, just in their wooden boats, came out and rescued 380 of them. And they've had actually children of the survivors here in China just recently. I guess that's a PR thing, but it's a really good PR thing, because what it's doing is showing that there was such a strong relationship between the Allies, including the Americans and the British, against the Japanese. What's wrong? I don't mean we need to be against the Japanese now, but what's wrong with revitalizing that relationship? Do you think that could ever happen?
I think at a people-to-people level, when people just have the opportunity to, work together, socialize together, get to know each other, I think it's very, very much possible. But it's when at the political level or interest groups, such as, with the anti-China lobby in Australia, I guess they try to do their best to prevent that. So and I guess maybe we'll talk about this later, but I guess I've had some recent examples where, people-to-people interaction with people from China and Australians. And I think, that if that's given the opportunity to flourish, I think it's certainly possible. But there's powers that be, or there's influence groups who really don't want to do that, because when you're ignorant, it's easy. When you're ignorant of another culture or another people, it's very easy to demonize them. So it's not the best way to maintain that is to keep people isolated. So I think they're fighting a losing battle, which is a good thing. But certainly there's still a lot of pressure to. I actually think if I went to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's risk register and went to their number one risk, I think it would be that peaceful relations break out between China and Australia, because without that, their entire they're not their reason for being, but how that organisation has morphed disappears, which means their funding, or a large proportion of their funding, would disappear. A large proportion of their power and relevance would disappear. And I think that sort of is a motivator. We need to keep this tension. I don't think they want to go to war per se, but we need to keep the tension of war so that we can keep building our own empire, keep the money coming in, keep our relevance.
Yeah, that's true. So, since you mentioned let's talk about this, because I know that you are doing a PhD in, for want of a better word, soil management. Is that right? Something along those lines.
Yep.
You were in China very recently, or not that long ago, and you're talking about the people to people. Now, what you're talking about there is agriculture. We're not talking about defense. You're a former military man. You hold the rank of major for the life. Is that right? So you can be called major for the rest of your life.
I just have to put retired in brackets. After it.
My father was a master mariner, and he was 94 when he passed away, and his driving license still said captain. So it's the same sort of thing. It's something. So you're going to be a major retired doctor, Cameron Leckie. That's a pretty big mouthful when you get there.
Happy to keep it short.
Yeah. DR PhD. What did you find when you came across to China as a former military man, an Australian military man, and the Australian military see China now as adversarial? What did you find when you came across here and spent a couple of weeks? You were in Gansu and Shanxi, I think. Is that right?
That's right. So it was last year. I think it was about October from memory, and I had the great opportunity to visit China as part of a study exchange. So as part of a group of 5 PhD students I work at the University of Southern Queensland, and the university had won a grant from the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations, which is an Australian government foundation, which is aimed at improving relations between Australia and China. And so there was a hang on, still got it here hanging up. It's called a Climate Future and Smart Agriculture Forum. So we had a delegation go over to China, and just in the last couple of weeks, a return delegation came to Toowoomba, where my university is. In Queensland. So we went over there, we had a forum, and then we had a study tour. So we were in Lanzhou for a couple of days, and then we caught the high-speed train to Yangling, which is near Xi'an. And I've got to say, the high-speed train was the biggest disappointment of the whole trip. Jerry, do you want to know why?
Go on.
Too many tunnels.
Yeah, you're in mountains, that area. Yeah, if you travel from Guangdong into Yunnan, you've got the same problem. You just can't see the countryside. Sorry about that.
Yeah, so there's lots of interrupted views, but no, I'm being flippant there, but no.
Yeah.
So a couple of days in each location. We were treated like kings, like we were hosted. We had tour of the universities. We got to meet with some of the Chinese students, and most of them, I think pretty much all of them, spoke English. I won't embarrass myself. I thought I might try to learn a little bit of Mandarin before I
remember you said you were going to try. How did that go?
Yeah, and that didn't go very well. So it's but I could say hello, and that was about it. Ni hao. And we got to, most of the Chinese students spoke some degree of English. It was communication wasn't easy because I think particularly where we were, I did as much walking as I could sort of before and after our daily activities because trying to see the place. And I saw one other European outside of our party in both of the cities. So I don't think there's a lot of Europeans. So probably, English probably isn't as spoken as often or perhaps as well in some of these areas as perhaps if I was in Shanghai or Beijing or some of the other larger centers. But, the conversations we had, people are no different. Like we're talking about, people worry about price of housing, price of cars, all that sort of stuff. No different to here in Australia. The only difference is that, the impression I got is that most Chinese people save to buy something, whereas most Australians go into debt to buy something. So, there's nuances, but there was similarity. So the people were very friendly. I got the impression, or I guess it reinforced my impression, how hardworking Chinese people are, disciplined they are. And you just see and we walk around the street, so you see people out either eating or talking or socializing, tend to be like groups of old ladies, generally older ladies, doing their dancing sort of out in the parks and stuff like that. Like, it was just a good vibe overall. I had no negative experiences whatsoever over there when I went walking. So I think I worked out I did about 50 kilometers of walking over a week. So I tried to do 2 walks a day. I mean, I wanted to see as much as I could, and I did not feel unsafe at any point in time, even though I was walking in a place I'd never been to before on my own. Sometimes it was dark when I was doing that. And to be honest, there's places in Australia where I feel far less comfortable walking than I did when I was in China. Maybe I was naive, but that was just the vibe I got.
No, I don't think you're naive at all. That's exactly my own experience. I mean, I've lived here, it's just over 20 years now. In fact, almost 21 years. And in the time that I've, certainly in the last 10 to 12 years, I've never felt a moment of being unsafe. There used to be one area that I didn't like to go. It felt to me like the Wild West, and that was the border crossing between Shenzhen and Hong Kong at a place called Lohu or Lowu. And a lot of people who I now know who used to do the same thing have told me the same. They used to feel that too. It was a place you wanted to get through as quickly as you could and get out as quickly as you could. It just didn't feel very safe, and it probably wasn't. That's all changed now. You're not being naive at all when you say I was comfortable walking down the street in the dark in a place I've never been to, because that's exactly what we can do out here, and it doesn't matter which city you're in. My wife and I have been in, I think, about 7 different cities in the last 10 days, and there's not been a single moment where we thought better not go down there. It's just quite safe. We just go somewhere, we walk out and we grab a DD car to go somewhere and then get out, have a walk around. Usually after dinner, we'll have some short walk somewhere, and never felt it. So no, it's not naive at all. So that brings us to the next question, which there have been some polls which say that many Australian people feel that there is a threat from China. I know that you and James Lawrenson, I'm not sure how to pronounce that.
Lawrenson, yeah, I think it's James Lawrenson. Yeah,
Lawrenson. You and James Lawrenson had a few back and forths about that. James is pretty good. I like him. He's a China realist from what I see. He sees the challenges, and he respects China for what it is, but he doesn't see the threat. That's the way I view his comments anyway. And I've had a couple of interactions with him myself. What do you make of that? Is China a threat in any way, shape, or form to Australia?
I think the biggest threat that Australia poses to China is if we were to stop trading. Now, James has just published an article actually at ASPI suggesting that it would actually be quite difficult for China to withdraw from Australian trade. I personally, I don't think that China poses any military threat to Australia other than through any actions that we take through our alliances. That's where the China threat comes into Australia. So I'm a big critic, for example, of not only AUKUS, but what's not really mentioned that often, the Forced Posture Agreement that's been signed between the Australian government and the US, which basically gives the United States unfettered access to agreed facilities, which are a whole bunch of our military facilities. And, you know, in a time when we're not at war, that, you know, probably doesn't matter. But I cannot see any Australian government having the intestinal fortitude to stand up to the United States if or when it came to the point when the United States says we're going to war with China, which means that the United States could launch military attacks on China from Australian soil. Obviously, Pine Gap and other intelligence facilities would be supporting that regardless. So if that is the case, we've handed over our sovereignty, and I would not be surprised if that occurred, that we had some return surprises coming from the Chinese to take out some of our key infrastructure or force projection facilities. And against those sort of, I'm talking about missile capabilities, Australia doesn't actually have any feasible air defence. So we're basically defenceless. So we've got ourselves in a situation where we could have no say in what's going on. We're used as a springboard to attack China, and then we can't defend ourselves. And then a war will end at some time, and then what? We're in a lose-lose situation, because let's just say that Australia and the United States came to a conflict in China and we defeated China. Well, what benefit is that to Australia? We've just, undone our major source of prosperity. And then if in the likely event that we lost that conflict, then what?
What benefit is that to anyone?
Exactly. Yeah. We've put ourselves in a position where we're dependent on the good graces of the Chinese government as to how well we get treated. And I don't know, maybe the Chinese would be more benevolent than what a Western power would be, but we'd be in for a pretty difficult time. So we put ourselves in a lose-lose position, and unnecessarily.
Yeah, it seems to me that it's not the public that are along this line. The polls are suggesting that there's less and less people feeling threatened by China in Australia, which indicates that there's a lot of money being wasted. on this kind of media narrative and the academic support. When I say academic, I mean that loosely, the think tank support for the China narrative. But then you've got people like Matthew Knott, who an Australian journalist, who are making huge claims about the threat from China. Why do they do that?
Well, I think, and I think this is a good thing, I think they've lost control of the narrative, Jerry.
Right.
So if we go back a couple of years, I think there's probably a lot more buy-in as to the threat that China poses. And I mean, if I'm reading that all the time, and there's a bunch of people who are reading about things and making assessments. But if you're someone who isn't really interested in geopolitics and all that sort of stuff, and all you do, your information sources are what you hear on the radio, on the news, or the sort of extremist sort of views that are posed by that recent war cabinet thing that Sky News ran. Well, that's going to shape your perceptions of things. And I mean, that's the most effective form of propaganda, is just continual repetition of negative stories. And, when it comes to China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, you look at any media, legacy media in Australia, there's never a positive story. Now, sometimes those countries, we could argue, often those countries could be criticised, but there's no country on the planet that doesn't do something that, that could be a positive story, but you just never hear it. So it's just that constant repetition of negative stories. But I think,
go on.
Yeah, and I think there's also a bit of the boy who cried wolf. Like you can only maintain that for so long. And I think what we're seeing is a ramping up in the language, and it's becoming more and more less subtle, more in your face. And I think that's because the narrative is starting to fall apart. And if we look outside China and Australia, well, what else is going on in the world? We've just seen, or we're seeing, a genocide occurring in Gaza. So you talk about, the Uyghurs and a genocide, but there's no bodies. We look at Gaza and we see starving people. We're seeing people bombed to smithereens on a daily basis. And, people start to go, hang on, you're talking about the genocide there, but you're quiet on an actual genocide. You talk about the supposed genocide occurring in China, but then you ignore the actual one that's occurring in Gaza. Or you look at Ukraine as being destroyed on behalf of NATO and the United States, and then you look at the people of Taiwan, and they'll be sitting going, hang on, we don't want to be used as the next Ukraine in a war against China. So I think there's some real issues that they face in maintaining the narrative. So my hope is that, the narrative collapses of its own absurdity in short order. And I'm here just to help it along a bit.
I can put a bit of perspective on the Xinjiang genocide story, because we're currently in Kashgar. We traveled by plane into Urumqi this time. My wife and I have cycled across Xinjiang, leaving Urumqi on bikes and going across to Gansu, near to Lanzhou, but not actually into Lanzhou. But Lanzhou is the next major city outside of Xinjiang. So we traveled in a similar area to where you were. And I can vouch for the fact that we left Urumqi and went by fast train to Borla. We went from Borla by bus to Korgash. We went by, I think we went by bus again to a place called Yining, Ili Prefecture. So we've traveled across there. Then we flew to Kashgar, and tomorrow we're flying to another place called Shachi. And there has been not a single shred of evidence of any kind of oppression, persecution, not even any tension. We're just seeing Uyghurs speaking their language, doing their thing. I even learned how to say thank you in Uyghur today. So Rahmatan. So we're just doing our thing here, and there's just nothing there. There's no presence whatsoever of any tension. So I can kind of put that one to bed. I guess we've traveled several thousand kilometers in the last few days in Xinjiang.
I think we might talk about a bit later, but the Consul General from China, who's based in Brisbane, he was asked a question at one of the events I went to, and the questioner said, well, let's get to the elephant in the room. And it was a question about, human rights in China, and in particular against the Uyghurs. So it was quite interesting to see his response, which I thought was quite brilliant.
Go on.
And it sort of just reinforced what the earlier presentation he gave. But basically, the Chinese government position is that the best way to support human rights is the development that's occurring in China. So all the growth, in the infrastructure building, new industries, etc. That's the best way to address human rights. He asked his interlocutor, had he been to Xinjiang? Of course, he had not. And so he said, you're welcome to come and have a look for yourself. And then he very cleverly put it back on Australia and our history with our First Nations people, which, if any, people outside of Australia, we have, a big gap in life expectancy, education, just the general well-being of our First Nations, Aboriginal, Torres Strait populations compared to the rest of Australia. And he very put it back, we're not, as in Australia is not perfect either. And he sort of also reinforced that we don't need to be lectured to, as in China, but we're happy for dialogue. And I think, that's an honest broker would be happy for dialogue as far as these, Nathan Russo or any of those people from ASPI who've written all these reports. Why don't you physically go and visit China and see for yourself, as opposed to sitting in your office and downloading satellite data to try and create a story?
I've actually invited Nathan Russo to China. I said I'd go with him into Xinjiang and show him the places that I've seen and introduce him to the people that I know there. He declined politely. So Nathan Russo and I have had quite a few. For people who don't know, Nathan Russo is the person who created the narrative of the camps, or basically he was involved in analysis of where the camps were. He didn't create the narrative; that was someone else. But that was probably Adrian Zenz created it, and then it's been kind of he's one of the architects of it, to say that there are this many camps. I think it was 600 camps. I can't remember the right number, but it was many dozens of camps around Xinjiang. And the bottom line is there are prisons in Xinjiang. There's 24 million people here. Of course, there's got some prisons. So he's isolated a couple and identified them, and then he's isolated factories and farms and shopping centers and housing estates, because they have fences around them and they have gates on the front. And that is the culture of China. Your university that you visited in Lanzhou and Shanxi, they would have had gates at the front with security guards and fences around them. And that's normal. It doesn't stop people coming and going. What it does is it just makes sure that they're safe and the people in there are protected. So it's a very different thing. Someone says I should invite Scott Ritter. Actually, Scott Ritter and I are connected on X, so maybe that's something I should talk to him about that. But yeah, he's an interesting person. But the fact is, there's nothing going on. Go on a little bit more about the Consul General of from China, because he created something which you commented on, which I thought was brilliant, which was the A to E plus F.
Yeah, so I think in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I've had the opportunity to see him speak twice. So once he came to the university. Now, I'm not sure how I got organised for that, but he came to my university and just did a talk on China and where China's heading in the world and Australia-China relations, which was very interesting. And it just continually, so much of the politics and that we see in Australia, well, particularly the stuff on the surface and the media, it's all theatrics and narratives and stuff like that. It just continues to reinforce like how business-like and methodical the Chinese government is, and also how on message, like everything that he presented sort of mirrored what you hear. So they're all on message when it comes to telling the China story and where we're going. So I won't sort of go too much on that, other than one thing. So he's very friendly, genial, engaging, and he did do one slide which covered Taiwan, and there was a definite edge in how he presented about Taiwan. Like, he's polite and stuff like that. But that also reinforced to me is like, the China, as in mainland China, has a lot of skin in the game and what happens in Taiwan. Whereas Australia, we have none. We're interfering something as an outsider. We have no understanding of what's going on. And if we were to get involved in anything to do with Taiwan, which is, an unresolved issue from from the Civil War, we're playing with fire. So that's what just reinforced to me that Australia's best not to get involved in that. We have no place to be involved. Obviously, fully support, like our Prime Minister said, we don't want to see any unilateral, by force of arms change in the status of that. Like
No.
that's been the case.
Well, China doesn't. It's patiently.
Exactly.
Even Donald Trump presented this. Now, I don't often agree with Donald Trump, but he said that Xi Jinping had said to him, "We won't invade Taiwan during your presidential term." Now, of course, that's a misrepresentation of what would have been said. We have no plans to invade Taiwan. Why would we? We'll just patiently wait for them to come back to us. We know that's going to happen. As long as the status quo is maintained and you don't try and take it away from us, we're not going to fight to keep it, but we're going to fight to defend it. That's China's policy on it.
That's right. And so, that just reinforced to me that, we don't want to play with fire in there. But then at the other event, which
here's someone we both know just come in to say hello.
So there's delegations from the just see Warwick's made a comment there. The forum. So there was from my university, some speakers, as well as a couple from the Chinese embassy, the president of Lanzhou University, as well as the consul general.
Wow.
And he presented the A to E that's driving positive Australia-China relations. So the first one was adjacent, as in that we're near neighbours in the Asia Pacific, which obviously, I'm a soil scientist, so I'm interested in geology and things like that. And, for the next few million, if not billion years, Australia and China are going to be occupied. We're sharing a part of the world. So, that's not going to change. We might as well make the most of it rather than not. Then he spoke about the benefit. So B's benefit, and he talked about the prosperity of both Australia and China being tied together. And he made the statement, which I'm happy to agree with, that when both Australia and China prosper, the world prospers. And that, why would we want it to be any different? The C was being complementary economies. So we're not competing against we complement each other. So, that's another plus that we have.
So just to clarify on that one, it would be fair to say Australia has what China needs, which is massive amounts of resources. And that is what some people think is the threat. China will come and take them if we don't keep on selling them. So that's a problem. So the answer is keep on selling them, because China never needs to come and take them.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't even take that argument seriously, though. Like, it's so much easier to buy something than it is to invade a country. You're in Xinjiang. It's 1.7 square million kilometres in area. I know that because the area I work in is southern Queensland, northern New South Wales. It's exactly the same size, 1.7 square million kilometres. So, we're talking huge areas. So to come and try and occupy and run a country of that size, like it's really a bit silly. Then the D was dialogue, so about respectful communications, and that's how we help each other address our challenges. So we're always going to disagree. Every country, even our best allies, for example, the United States and Australia at the moment, we have disagreements. So how do you deal with that? Well, it's through dialogue, respect, and through that process, you also build trust. The last E, the E was engagement, and I guess he was talking about across sectors and at multiple levels. So from individual visitors, students, tourists, through to governments, through to industry, business, education. That engagement helps bring things together. So I was scribbling notes, taking that down. And then, to my great surprise, we had the next speaker was from the Queensland government. It was an assistant minister responsible, for international students, and his name is Herman Forster. And he gave a very eloquent response, and he said, I'd like to add an F, and the F is friendship. So if we get the A to E right, we can be friendly as countries. Yeah. And I mean, my way of thinking, who needs enemies? We don't need enemies. We just want to get along in the world, because there's more than enough problems. And I'm a soil scientist. I'm far more concerned about the health of our Australia's soils and, the landscape and soil and water in general than I am about any military threat that Australia faces. So if we can get to the point when we have friendly relations with China, Indonesia, ASEAN partners, every country in the world, because we have Australia has no natural threats. Then we can focus on the real issues that we face, the sort of fundamental building blocks that keep our society going.
So let's ask a kind of more personal question. You're in Australia, you're working in a university. What's the talk like around the water fountain? You don't get in the morning, talk about the footy last night in the same way that you talk about the threat from China. What do your friends think about China?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I do most of my, I've obviously got a positive view towards China, and I think it's critically important for Australia's future that Australia-China relations are good and strong. But I don't generally talk too much. I don't put it out there too much unless an opportunity arises. And I think there's still a lot of people in Australia who have a mistrust for China. And there's some, I think, deep-seated reasons for that. For some of that. And a lot of it, I think, is based on the media coverage and the sort of propaganda and ignorance. So it's quite interesting. Like the people that I speak to who have been to China, visited China, in general, will have a positive view of China. And the people who are less likely to have a positive view of China are those who haven't been there. And I've had a couple of interactions with people, and they've sort of said, "Weren't you scared or weren't you worried when you were there?" And I think that's the sort of indicator that that fear. All the CCT everywhere, and I noticed there's CCT everywhere when I was walking around, but I can't remember seeing any police when I was in China, other than there was, I think, a vehicle accident or something like that. And there's a few police attended that, but there's no feeling of like a police state or anything like that. So
what do you think that they would have been? I mean, they're asking you, weren't you scared? What were they, or what are they scared of? Because I get this all the time. I wouldn't dare set foot. I say, why don't you come and have a look for yourself? If you really don't believe me, come and see for yourself. And they say, I'm not setting foot in China. What are they scared of?
I don't know. I think it's the ignorance. It's the unknown. I think that's because you create. All you need to do is create that uncertainty, a bit of fear, and your mind will do the rest. So I think it probably, people hear negative comments, repeated, and human rights abuses and blah, 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 and your imagination will do the rest.
Right.
Yeah. And if someone who's not particularly interested in international relations, geopolitics, foreign affairs, all that sort of stuff, and as I said before, if all you get is all the signals you're getting about China are coming from our mainstream media, then it's a perfectly reasonable view to have of China. But that's why that engagement is so important. The more people to people interactions we have, we can break that down. Now, we're probably not going to break it down entirely, but if you get 10, 20, 30, 40% of the population who starts to have, really positive experiences and that with China, then that's enough to sort of, make sure that we have enough, balance in our view of China. No, we don't need to be sensible. We don't, like with any country, we're going to have issues. We're going to disagree on things. We need to be able to manage that. But through having and understanding where another country is coming from. So like from an agricultural perspective, one of the things I learned, so in Australia, I think, and the same as the United States, we have about 8 hectares of fertile land or arable land per person. In China, it's about half a hectare.
Right.
So if you think about the implications of that, from a food security perspective, we have a lot of risk tolerance. If things go wrong, we got plenty of space to grow food. If you're in an area where you've got half a hectare, now hectare's 100 meters by 100 meters, so 50 meters by 100 meters. If that's the area you've got to grow food per person, your margin for error is zero.
Right.
So there's these contextual things, and you can see why that can lead to, excuse me, a society in China which is more about the community as opposed to in Australia and the Western world is more about the individuals, because the margin for error is much smaller. And when you have starving people, well, that's when the whole civilization and society starts to unravel. So obviously that influences how China organizes itself.
That's really interesting. Will you be watching the military parade on the 3rd of September? Do you think you'll get an opportunity?
I'll probably just watch some highlights of that, but I'm sure
Yeah.
there'll be plenty of commentary. And I normally don't watch our news or whatever, but I'm sure that we'll find some,
I'm
some
just wondering.
suitably.
I'm gonna try and watch Sky News version of it. I actually have a very. I'm going to be very privileged this year. I'm going to Guangdong television station to watch it live and have a discussion online with
Ah,
someone while we're watching it. And
that'd
I'm
be good.
kind of nervous about that because I've never done live TV before, but this
Yeah,
is interesting for me.
yeah,
They're going to give me some talking points, and then I can create my own talking points as well. So it's a really new departure for me. But I'll be watching the CCTV English language version of it in Guangdong television, talking to someone. That's yet to be confirmed who I'm talking to, but I think I know who it'll be. And I'll actually get to see the real thing. But what I really am interested in seeing is how Sky News in
yeah.
Australia portrays it.
Yep.
What do you reckon?
There'll be the dark red background. There'll be the scary music, and they'll make the most of it. Which I was going to mention before, but you might remember in February or March, a Chinese flotilla, 3 ships, circumnavigated Australia. Now, Australia's been playing in the South China Sea and in and around the East China Sea and around Taiwan. You're doing sailing through the straits and that for decades, and China's been starting to push back in recent years, and so we've had the incident with I think sonar or something with when we had Australian Navy divers in the water, as well as with some of our aircraft, which to me is just, I mean, we talk about innocent passage and all that sort of stuff. Well, no military activity is innocent because at the very least you're collecting some sort of intelligence or probing for reaction. So that's all sort of nonsense. And it's obviously got to the point where China said enough's enough. And so they sent the couple of ships down. Then halfway between New Zealand and Australia, they did a live fire exercise, which sent shockwaves through this country. And then they continued on and headed around Australia. So to me, that was a message. And I mean, you don't need to be a sleuth to work out what the message was. It's like, if you're going to play in our backyard, we're going to play in your backyard. And I'll be surprised. I don't think we'll see that again unless Australia keeps, doing what it's been doing in the South China Sea.
They also sent out an aircraft carrier through what they call the second island chain, what America calls their defensive chain, which is their defensive chain is all around China. I don't know what they're defending against, but this was the first time.
Yeah, there was mind-boggling. I can't remember where. I think it was Aspie. But it might have been a US. No, it could have been Aspie or Low Interpreter, but they were talking about, and I actually think, I can't remember the author, sorry, but they're actually saying, I was speaking to an American who said that if they lose, as in the US loses the first island chain, then China's going to end up off the coast of California. Yeah. And that's what the US fear was, which is just the most ridiculous statement and view of the world that you could possibly fathom. Like, how do they figure that China is going to go all the way across the Pacific Ocean and send aircraft carriers and that to sit off the coast of America? It's just nonsensical. But that's the sort of level of
well, they could do that. The one issue is that China, it's got 1 million people in its army, but it doesn't have the resources to send an army to America. There's no threat of an army a Chinese army ever landing on either the East Coast or the West Coast. It wouldn't happen. It simply can't happen. But they could. And in fact, they are currently sailing north of Canada, and they're doing activities with the Russian Navy in the northern waters of Canada, which used to be the ice-frozen area. So there are ships up there that the Canadian government are watching and saying, what are the Chinese doing in our waters? Well, the fact is, you're in China's waters, so why can't China? They haven't done anything illegal. They're just floating around in the area. But as you say, they're going to be doing some intelligence gathering. They're looking at response times, and they're certainly doing something there, but they're in that water quite legitimately and quite legally. So they're going to be doing more of that, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So if we want to do that off the coast of China, then we can expect that favour to be returned. And like for Australia, like in my view, we should actually be doing joint patrols with the Chinese Navy, the PLAN, to make sure that our trade routes with China are secure, because how much of our trade actually goes either way. So that would make more sense.
You are by far, or China is by far Australia's number one in both imports and exports by a long, long way. So that's a very important factor. It's something like, it's not quite 40%, but it's in the high 30% of all of Australia's trade is with China. So that's something worth noting. A really interesting thing, because that doesn't count Hong Kong, which is up there in the top 10, and also Taiwan, which is number 5. And that is also China. So the trade routes between Hong Kong, Taiwan, and mainland are all vitally important. So you're absolutely right. And I think it's been done before. A few years ago, weren't there some Chinese ships coming into Sydney Harbour and Darwin and a few other places?
Yeah, I can't. Was that 2017 or 2019? I think was the last time that occurred. But yeah, that's right. I mean, I have no problem with the Australian Navy exercising with any country, the United States, Indonesia, Malaysia, China, anyone. I think that's part of diplomacy. It's also about building mutual trust and understanding, and that's just as important in the military field as it is in the diplomatic field. But yeah, so if we have Talisman Sabre with the United States and all these countries, up in Shoalwater Bay in central Queensland, that's fine. But let's have an exercise with China as well. We should be, as like countries like Indonesia do. So Indonesia, I think they're in the last Talisman Sabre, but we have exercise with them. They have exercise with China. They have some Russian that. I have no problem with that, because that's all part of building that mutual understanding, which actually reduces the risk of conflict.
Would it be fair to say that the more countries you have military exercises with means the less countries you have adversarial relations with?
Exactly. It's all part of building that. So like one of the concepts I think we should be looking to is building a positive peace. So at the moment, we have what we call a negative peace, which is in Australia, which is the absence of conflict, but it's inherently negative and unstable. So what we should be building is a positive peace. It's all about multipolarity in that, but it's putting all the building blocks in place so that we eliminate the root causes of any issues, and then gives us the space when we do have a disagreement that we can solve that without resorting to military force. So I think, the goal of our foreign policy in Australia should be that, building a positive peace, fundamentally removing any objects which could lead to conflict. And we're fortunate because where we are geographically wise, and you look at ASEAN, how does ASEAN, obviously we've just had the recent brouhaha between was it Cambodia and Thailand in recent weeks. But that's sort of through Malaysia's intervention, from what I understand. So generally, that grouping of countries being able to manage, they have lots of disagreements, but they manage conflict without resorting to armed conflict, or disagreements without resorting to armed conflict. And that's what we should be looking for in Australia, because I see no reason why Australia should be in a military conflict with anyone in our region, because there's no natural threat that we face other than what we do through our own silly actions.
You're part of the IPAN, is that right? The Independent Peaceful Australia Network. Tell us how that works.
So it's as it says, it's about independent Australian foreign policy and a peaceful foreign policy. I guess a core part of that is sort of looking to end AUKUS. And I mean, I served my country for 24 years, and I get a sick feeling in my guts every time I see a US military aircraft, ship, sailor, soldier, marine in my country, because we don't need them. They're not here for our benefit. We're capable of defending ourselves. We just need, the leadership in our country to do so. And I guess the other organisation I'm a member of is Australians for War Powers Reform, which is, at the moment, our Prime Minister can make the decision to commit Australian troops to overseas conflict, which is fundamentally undemocratic. And given our circumstances, there's been no case in Australia's history where the Parliament couldn't have been recalled and a decision made by the Parliament to actually commit Australian troops overseas, because look at every instance, we're sending people overseas, and we can't send more than a handful or a small force overseas at short notice. There's always time that the parliament can do it. If Australia was attacked, that's fair enough. You've been attacked, you need to respond. We need to defend ourselves. But really, other than World War II, and that was, an exceptional circumstance, every occasion since we could have very well used our parliamentary processes. And it's important because if you only need the Prime Minister to make that decision, it's a lot easier to pressure the Prime Minister as opposed to all of our parliamentarians.
Yeah.
So we see how, there's a hidden power structures that exist in the world, which what's happening in Gaza have sort of exposed the mask of, whereas when there's a couple of hundred parliamentarians making that decision on behalf of their citizens, it's a lot harder to get us into conflicts which we don't or should think twice about getting involved with.
In terms of global perspective, is Australia powerful enough diplomatically and economically to be able to say to countries like the USA, hey, hang on a second, we don't really need this war that you're proposing. Let's discuss it. Does Australia have any clout in that respect?
I wish we did. I think over the last decade we have further subordinated ourselves to the United States.
Right.
I really don't know what's driving it, but I don't know what's driving it. But what I think is driving it is that Australia had the United Kingdom, the Empire, British Empire, sort of as our protectorate until that fell apart in Singapore in 1942. And that was taken over by the Americans. And if you read what Douglas MacArthur said, there was nothing to do with supporting Australia, but it was all about we're a useful piece of turf for the United States to project force to attack Japan. And so we have this insecurity complex. And I guess that this all comes back to our, the fundamental mismatch between our history and our culture and where we leave our geography. And we still, I think, are still trying to have security from Asia rather than within Asia. And if you look over if you look over 100, 200-year time frame, well, that's going to fail sooner or later. If we take that approach, it's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think the number one thing that's happening in the world at the moment is the decline of the United States empire. Like, it's rapidly falling apart. President Trump's sort of accelerating that process, which in the long run is probably a good thing. But Australian politicians are hanging on way too tightly rather than, at the very least, we should be hedging our bets. And I think we have weak leadership in as far as what I think our current government is trying to do is tread that very precarious line between not wanting to offend our allies, the United States and the collective West, and not, they're followers, they're not leaders. And, the stakes couldn't be higher, really. So we really need some independence and, drive to think what is in our interest, because what's in the United States' interest is not in our interest. United States needs to bring China down for it to regain hegemony, which I don't think is in the interest of the population of the United States, but the people who run the place, it is. Yeah. And that's obviously the exact opposite to Australia's interest. So, unfortunately, we have, walking that fine line, and I think we, the barbed wire fence, and I think we're at great risk of slipping and finding ourselves impaled on that barbed wire through our own lack of commitment and leadership to our own independence and sovereignty.
So you retired from the military after 24 years, and then, and I'm not going to ask why, because this is for another discussion, you went into soil management. And is there anybody like you who served their time currently working in the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Trade, anywhere like that? Do people like you with your open-mindedness actually stay in government or get into government after serving? You served your country, and it's clearly you know what you're talking about. Wouldn't it be great if the Department of Defense, the Ministry of Defense, came to you and said, what do you think about this? But they don't ask you. They disregard opinions of people like you. Is there anyone like you working in the government?
Yeah, I haven't really maintained too closer contact since I left defence. And I guess these views were developing as I left defence, but they were largely internal, as in that's what I was thinking. And yes, I would have chats with people, and one-on-one, or in a small group, like people would joke about the United States and wouldn't do it. But most people in the military, they serve in their country, believe they're doing the right thing, and don't really want to get involved in all the politicking type stuff. But it is sort of interesting, and I wouldn't say large numbers, but I reasonably regularly get contacted by ex-military people, and and it's quite gratifying, actually. Like, some people say thank you for actually articulating a different view. So there is a proportion of, and I don't know how big it is. I don't think it would be particularly big, but there is a proportion of ex-military people who certainly are quite critical of our current foreign defence policy. But yeah, as to how much influence we have, well, I don't know. But if people don't speak up and articulate a different vision, well, we're never going to change. So I guess that's what motivates me.
So we're going to wrap up soon. Where can people find you? Because you've got some really good takes. You've actually done some good writing as well. And where can people find the things that you write about? I know you've done a little less recently because of the PhD, but where can we find you?
Yeah, Twitter's probably where I put most of my sort of geopolitical stuff. So that's at Lecky_Cameron. I've also just created a Substack, which I've had 2 articles on, but I'll do bits and pieces as I get time. And I guess the 2 articles, the first one was called "The Crusade Against Multipolarity," and I think we need an organising principle to understand what's happening in the world. And my view of it is we are witnessing the collective West, led by the United States, in a crusade against multipolarity. And that links what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening against Iran, what's happening in Ukraine with Russia, what's happening against China. And I've used the word crusade deliberately because I don't think they're going to stop until they are stopped, the people who are driving this crusade. So the neoconservative, and there's different reasons, like what's driving Europe is what's different to what's driving the United States. Australia's largely along for the ride, but we are a part of it. And then the last one I think I published last week is I think trapped by our own rhetoric. So basically, if you look at what's happening in Ukraine, there's no way the sort of Western governments and that can sort of really resolve the conflict, because we're trapped by our own lies about why the war started and why it's been continued. And to actually resolve the conflict needs acknowledging that the West is really largely, as people such as Mearsheimer and Scott Horton and Professor Sachs, many others have put, is really as a result of Western action. So to end it, we need to acknowledge that, so we can come up to some arrangements with Russia, so that a security architecture that works for all countries, including Russia and including Ukraine.
Yeah, I've been interested in watching that, because Lavrov, Medvedev, and even Putin all saying the same thing. We're only asking for what we were asking for 3 years ago. Nothing's changed. They're not. That is the truth. Yeah, nothing has changed. So give us what we wanted 3 years ago, and 500,000 people would still be alive.
Exactly, and that's the tragedy of it. And that just highlights how ruthless these people are. I think evil's an appropriate term to use.
Yeah. Actually, someone's just put a really interesting comment. I like this comment. Socialist communist countries conduct these parades because without their military, the revolution would not have been successful. And that there is something in that. That's very true, Craig. Thank you. Without the People's Liberation Army, there would not have been a communist uprising, and a popular one at that. And that's what gives China its legitimacy. The people of China fully support the PLA. They're really, really supportive of it. So I just put up, where was it? I had your name up there. This is where people can find you on X, and from there they can link to anything else that you comment on, and your Substack. I saw you started a Substack very recently. That was just like 3-4 weeks ago.
A couple of weeks ago, yeah.
Yeah, I saw
And
that.
I worked out how to create images in Grok.
I haven't done anything like that. I'm the complete Luddite. I mean, look at me here. This is all electronic magicry to me. I'm the complete Luddite when it comes to anything like that. But I am on X. I am on Twitter. I am on Twitter and X, same thing. I am on YouTube. So, and I even got on TikTok recently too. But I'm going to leave it there. Is there any finishing notes you want to talk about with the China-Australia relationship?
Well, first, it's like thank you, Jerry, for what you do and the opportunity to have this chat tonight. And I just don't see any negatives to Australia having a positive relationship with China. There's so many positives, and we have so many other things that we can deal with if we can put this whole China as threat narrative to bed and get on with just developing good relations.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, let's on that happy note end it, because here in Kashgar it's 7:10 p.m., but it's only 5 p.m. It's still broad daylight outside the window here, so we're going to